Welcome back, you filthy exiles. I finally got the build guide put together. I finally almost finished the character. There is some minning and maxing that can be done. Now, first thing off the cuff, is this an Uber character? You could do some Ubers potentially. I found it really difficult, mainly not because of the damage, but because of the ability of the character to survive. Which means it needs more damage, and there's a few ways to do that, and I'll talk about that at the very end of the video. So just to sort of run through, in this video we're going to change the format up a bit and be a little more structured. So we're going to have content that this build can do and can't do currently, cost of the build mechanics, gearing, skill gem setups, skill tree setups, Pantheon, and we'll cover off on what makes my character look so cool. Anyway, let's get into the video and talk about what this character can do. Okay, so for content completion so far, we've done everything to unlock all of our void stones and almost all map completion, and we've just been doing juicy T16s, to be honest with you. I actually spec towards Maven Crucibles at this stage. I do have Delve in here, obviously. I'm going to be delving with my next tune that you guys would have seen me streaming, and there'll be a video up on that tomorrow when I level that up to endgame. But I do Remnants of the Past farming and a lot of Crucible farming, because I found out that the Crescent splinters for the Maven encounter, Maven Writs, are like 15-16 chaos each, and you can get a lot doing this, plus Awaken Gems and whatnot as well, so it's really profitable. Outside of that, yeah, it's pretty much doing everything that I need it to do. Now, other content-wise that it can do is around, it can do things like Ritual really well. It does Metamorph really well, because it's sort of like a semi-boss, so I can do that really well. It does do Blights really well, however, I don't like Blight, so I haven't been playing it. As I said, Rituals does not do, Legion Encounters very well, nor does it do Breaches very well. So I wouldn't recommend playing this build of doing either of those. Abysses, it slays Abysses, but I'll be honest with you, Abyss is just terrible, so it's not worth playing anyway. Expedition, it does Expedition extremely well, because you just set and forget, run away, and everything will be dead, so I am currently Astragali farming. It can do Sacred Grove. I'm not a big fan of Sacred Grove, but if you wanted to play Sacred Grove, it'd have no issues. Pretty much Essences, you can do Incursions, but it's a little more risky with Incursions. You cannot delve with it, which is probably my biggest issue, because I love delve. But outside of that, it's an overall pretty good build. Now, I can also do pretty proficiently a mapping, and I do run Wellspring of Creation, because it does so much damage. You can run through maps pretty much unchecked, though I keep dying to shit like Ubercyrus. Anyway, it does a lot of content, and it's not the sort of build that will limit you, but just be wary that it is a little squishier, though it does have some pretty high octane DPS. And if you wanted to, you could switch it out and use Consecrated Path, because it's basically exactly the same tree, exactly the same gear, different skill, and you don't use Focus Ballista. But that's pretty much it for what it can and can't do. But I should probably say what it can't do is Uber Shaper. But that's as far as I'm aware on the Uber side of things, and Delve. Everything else is pretty much open for discussion. Okay, so approximate price of this build, if we just run through. So we're looking at 3 Chaos for the Brutus. We're looking at a fair bit more for the Helm, because we have Astral Projector, about 3 Divine. We're looking at a fair bit for the shield as well. That doesn't exist, so let's get rid of that. Like 70 Chaos for the shield average. For the Astramentis, because that's perfectly rolled, this one's going to be a little more expensive at 1 Divine. My rings are actually pretty cheap, so it just really min-maxing defenses at this stage. Now, 6 link Fortress is up to 5 Divine. My Magnate is actually probably about a Divine, because it's corrupted and it has Magic Find on it. Again, gloves, really not that expensive, pretty affordable, but still within that 80 Chaos to 1 Divine range. My boots will be a little more expensive, because they're max rolled in strength, but they also have the crit roll on them, so they're like 1 to 4 Divine, probably average about 2 Divine. But realistically, if you just run lab, you'll get these anyway, because yeah, they're quite easy to get, and I'll explain that when we go to gearing. Flask, really expensive one is this one. This one actually goes for like 5 divine right now. I got it for 4 originally. And Dying Sun, pretty standard, like 40 chaos. Bottled Faith, what are they? Shit, they went up to, so like 2 to 3 divine. I got mine for like 2. So things are going up in the league, just be wary. Now, my cluster jewels, this one is probably the most expensive out of them. Yeah, 1 divine, and basically everything else is 5 chaos. Obviously, totem builds still aren't that popular. And like 90 chaos. So, you know, there's probably like 20, and everything else in here is pretty cheap. So this is, yeah, Lethal Pride's dirt cheap. And I've got another cluster jewel in here too. So probably wrapped up in this build is about 20 to 25 divine, give or take. Now, can this be much more expensive? Absolutely. If you get aspect of Carnage into this build with Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame, and that's a big upgrade that you need to get that like uber face melting level of damage, that's going to set you back about 100 divine because they're like 50 div each. They're super rare and they're super hard to get. But if you really want to push this build, that's how you push this build further, and then just natively level it up. So the tree that I have provided, and we'll talk about like mechanics and damage and stuff like that shortly, is like just shy of, I think, total aggregate's like 17 million DPS, which is pretty indicative here. This just melts shit. But price-wise, 17 million DPS for like 2025 divine is pretty good. And to mean to say, like, the stuff that you need to get this rolling, like Brutus Lead Sprinkler, is like 3 chaos. Crown of Eyes, you can get one that's like nothing's been done to it for absolutely dirt cheap. And you can take this build to T16 maps with a Tabula Rasa as your chest piece until you upgrade to like a 5-link Iron Fortress for like maybe 50 to 80 chaos or something like that. Anyway, that's it for pricing on the build. Okay, so for the most important part of this build is the mechanics behind how this works and what makes it tick. So for this, we're going to pull open. Alright, so let's just open up configuration and I'll explain what I've got ticked on here so you can see the build's not bullshit. I always do this, it just makes sense. So first thing of all, Guardian and Pinnacle Boss is ticked on, so it's not like this, hey, I've got more DPS than what I am saying that I actually have. Not that that would be hugely disparity, but, you know, just to not set expectations that shouldn't be set. So just rolling through endurance charges, I get this from having Enduring Cry. Sorry, forgot what it was called for a second there. So I have this mapped to my move button, as you'll be able to see in here. So I generate endurance charges while enemies are around me, which just makes sense. So I have leeching. This is coming from the Ascendency. So this will be the War's Herald, which means I leech 2% of the damage my totems dish out. Onslaught, I have this just built into the build based on the cluster jewels. So Onslaught's actually coming from Sleepless Sentry, so every time I put down a totem, I get Onslaught. So we've got, do you have a totem summon? Yes, we all summon totems. Have you summoned a totem recently? Well, that's how we fucking do damage. So yes, we've always summoned a totem. And if you really want to get it fickle about it, we have 5 totems. So that gives me another 100,000 DPS. Thank you very much. Are you on Consecrated Ground? Yes, I'm always on Consecrated Ground. And the reason for that is I have a Bottled Faith. And that auto pops once the flask tops off. So, and that's always happening because I'm always generating flask charges. And flask charges generate 50% more than what they normally would because I have a Magnate, which gives me 50% increased flask charges gain, which buffs that up. So it means it pops more. Now, have you crit recently is really important to understand in totem builds. You cannot crit, as in your character cannot crit, the totem crits, which is why we use on the boots, and we'll talk about this when we get to gearing, we use the 120% increased critical strike chance if you haven't crit recently, because that's a global stat. And because your totems crit, you always have that 120%. So that's really important to remember as well. Now, I always have Blood Stance on, and that's the same as when I'm in game. So if we have a look, Blood Stance on, no bullshit. I didn't just put that in there to inflate the DPS numbers. That's a legit mechanic that I use because it helps with shotgunning. Some people would argue having an AoE effect would help, but I have so many projectiles that I want that extra damage. If I strip this off, it does drop my damage back a fair bit, so I want it on. So, moving down, nothing in here has been tweaked or changed. I do have Ignite because I don't have Elemental Focus, so my fire damage ignites, and also I have that chance coming from my Ascendency, which is coming from Sun's Light, so 25% chance to ignite. So it's very likely with 14 projectiles, I'm going to ignite. Fire exposure, this is coming from my my Awaken Jewel. So if I go to my Volcanic Fissure and I go to Awaken Fire Penetration, I have 10% chance to inflict fire exposure. So that's where that's coming from, and that's on hit, and that's on hit from the totems. So that does actually inflict, and it does actually damage the enemy. Is the enemy covered in ash? This is coming from my Ascendency, so this is coming from Death's Fury. So cover rare or unique enemies in ash for 10 seconds on hit, which is what my totems do. So they are covered in ash. And then, is the enemy on consecrated ground? Well, that's the same as me standing on consecrated ground because we have a bottled faith. That's how that works. That's pretty much it for mechanics that you need to understand. So the overall way that the build actually works is it uses Brutus Lead Sprinkler. And so it stacks. So the reason why this is a strength stacker is because the stat adds 4 to 7 damage to attacks with this weapon per 10 strength. So the more damage we stack, we get 4 to 7 fire damage, which is your min and max damage, multiplied out by your 10 strength. And so obviously this build stacks a shitload of strength. And so that's what buffs up our damage. Now, other mechanics that you need to understand is just the sequence and popping the totems itself. So the way that I pop a totem, I'll do 3 of my Volcanic Fissure Totems. I'll pop my Ancestral Protector Totem, and then I'll hit my War Chief Totem. And so I have 2, 2, or 2 and 2, and then 1. And then if I've got my Val Ancestral War Chief Totem, I'll repop 3, hit my Protector Totem, and then I'll hit my War Chief Totem, my Val War Chief Totem. And then just for more damage, I'll hit R on the enemy and then just do shitloads of damage. And that's basically the mechanics that work. Like, there's nothing else more complicated than that. And a lot of where the damage is actually coming from as well, not just the strength stack, is from the active speed of your active totems. So we use the Protector Totems because they significantly buff up our Protector Totems buff to our other totems. Because what the Protector and the War Chief Totems do, using the word totem a lot, is buff up the main damage dealing totems. And so we get this Ancestral Protector Totem grants 18% increased attack speed while active is the best roll on a helm you can get. And then we also get that from the Ascendency. So if we have a look here, 100% increased buff effect or effects of buffs from your Ancestor Totems, and that's coming from War's Herald. And then it actually comes down in Panopticon as well here, so 50% increase. And the reason why we use Ancestral Guidance is we get 30%, and then we get 30%, so we get another 60%. The more that you buff up your totems, your support totems, the more significantly buffed your main damage totems are. And so when you drop your Protector Totems, you actually move crazy fast. When you leap slam, everything you do is elevated significantly, and that's really significant to how the build works and one of the key sources of damage. Now, the other thing that you'll also notice is I use a Crown of Eyes, same with pretty much anyone else who's playing this build. The reason why is increases and reductions to spell damage also apply to attacks at 150% their value. And this synergizes with this node here, Strength's damage. So the bonus that you get from Strength applies to all spell damage as well. Keyword as well. And I had a lot of people sort of debate this at the very start. Would this synergize with Iron Grip? Well, it says as well. And so if you do play with the stats, it actually does give you a buff. So if we have a look at this, if we just tack this in, right? So right now you have 4.137. If we add this in, this gives us another 159,000, right? So, you know, it does actually buff us up a little bit, but it's not worth the points that you would put into it, but it does work. So it's not one or the other, it's all of it. It says as well. So anyway, that's how the mechanics works on the build. And if you get confused with anything, hit me up in the comments and also in the Discord. There's a bunch of guys playing it. And I know a heap of people are playing this build now, so we can guide you on the right path. But this is basically where the damage comes from and how it works. Okay, so gearing wise, let's just work from the top. So we're using a Crown of Eyes. This is as discussed in the mechanics section. This is what buffs up our damage pretty significantly to our attacks and synergizes with our strength. And also we want the enchant on it for the Ancestral Protector Totems, grant 18% attack speed while active. This is the best roll. You could get increased projectiles. This just gives you so much more damage. Because more attack speed means more projectiles being launched, which means more damage. Now, the other thing is shield. You could use any shaped shield as long as it has +1 to number of summon totems. You can get an Alberon craft, which is super, super rare from Syndicate, which allows you to craft +1, and you can make an absolutely ridiculous shield, and I may go down that route. But it's up to you. It's really hard to get. Alternatively, you can get a shaped shield and get +1 to totems, +1 to totems that way, and that allows you to get that extra totem as you're sort of going through into the end game. Astramentis is an absolutely needed item. This gives you the ability to get enough dex and int to run everything on your build, and also you'll need the anoint for Shaman's Dominion and quality it, because that'll increase the amount of strength that you get out of it as well. Chest piece, I use the Iron Fortress. This is the best in slot. Everything else is sort of, this is where a lot of damage comes from. So the first thing is spell block is unlucky, which is problematic, but it's okay because I'll explain how I've gotten around that very shortly. But for this, you ideally need strength. So what you get from this is strength's damage bonus instead grants 3% increase melee physical damage per 10 strength. So by strength stacking, it synergizes with the Brutus lead sprinkler, and it synergizes with the chest piece, and it synergizes with the helm, and it just gives you, that's why this build has so much damage. This is one of the items where a lot of that damage comes from, so really needed. I'd suggest getting a cheap 5-link when you get to endgame maps. You can take it all the way to T16 and kill T16 bosses pretty easily with a 5-link. And what I'd do is just drop off Inspiration, or potentially drop off Fire Penetration until you can sort of satiate having the 5-link, the 6-link, and get that and unlock that. Biggest item you'll need, Brutus Lead Sprinkler. I have a corrupted version which gives me more crit chance. If we have a look at my actual crit on my hits, I have like 99.01% crit, which is pretty good, and 97% hit chance, so that's pretty significant. So we want to get crit as high as we can in this build, and we do that by getting a corrupted version of a Brutus. Now the reason why we need the Brutus, and this, as soon as you can get it, you should be able to get it for like 2-3 chaos. It's the 4 to 7 fire damage to attacks with this weapon per 10 strength, which is what makes it shine, and it's why it's a needed item for this build. Now, rings, literally just strength rings where you can get it, and all resistances and life. You can get like fire damage to ignited enemies or whatever if you want, but this is the route that I went, and it works really well. Same with the other ring, pretty similar, except I got magic fire on it. And if you have spare sockets or spare suffixes or prefixes in your ring, make sure you use a Exalted Orb to add in something. Like, even if it's a bad stat, it's better to have a stat than not have a stat. My gloves, I have a little bit of strength. I do have my implicit rolls pretty much where I want them. So 3% increased damage per 100 strength. So you get, by strength stacking, multiply that out. So I get like 36%, just about. No, yeah, something like that. 36% around abouts extra damage, which is pretty cool. Just go into D&D mode. And then on my other implicit, which is my my Exarch, I have increased critical strike chance for attacks. This could be higher, but it's already a pretty good roll, and it's a greater roll as well. My belt, I use a Magnate. The reason why I use the Magnate and I don't use an implicit belt is because of a couple of reasons. Number one, you actually get more damage out of the Magnate than you do getting a like 15% belt, and it's much, much cheaper. So it's more affordable for everybody. I like to make build guides that are more affordable for the player, not ridiculous, and have mirror tier items in it. So that's one of the reasons. It gives you double damage and it gives you triple damage, and this synergizes with the clusters that I use, which are weighted advantage, and I have 2 of these, which gives you 8% double damage when you stack them back up. And then you have another 10%, so you have 18% chance to do double damage with 5% chance to do triple damage. And I also get all resistances off this strength, and flask charge is gained as well at 50% increase rate, which is all really, really good quality stats for this type of build. And then I have a corrupted implicit for 27% rarity, which is really good for mapping, and it's why I get some pretty okay drops and make currency out of this build. So yeah, that's what I use for my belt. Boots, I use Alberon's Warpath, and I have a max rolled version. The reason why is pretty much for the strength roll. You also get chaos res, and you get movement speed too, which is pretty good. Now, you need the enchant for 120% increased critical strike chance. As I explained at the start of the video, because your character can't attack, you can never crit, so you always get that 120% chance, and your totems pick that up, because it's a global modifier, not a local modifier on your character, which makes it pretty good. Don't go and buy a set of boots with that. Just literally do lab a few times, and that there's such a limited boots pool that it's very likely it's going to pop up. I crafted mine, I enchanted it myself, so it does give you a pretty significant chop of that. Like, it gives you a huge buff up of damage, so definitely look into it. If you haven't got it, just run lab. I know lab is painful, but that'll get you over the line. For my flasks, I have an Eternal Flask with Corrupted Blood and increased recovery rate. I use a Progenesis, and what this does is when I take damage, it acts similar to Petrified Blood, and so 25% of my inbound damage is taken as damage over time for 4 seconds, and then the other 75% is taken head on, which does make this build survive a little longer in harder maps or with harder bosses and stuff like that. Though it does struggle at Ubers because I'm not good at Ubers, and Shaper was a terrible idea because I lost 43% XP and that tilted me. Anyway, for my Quicksilver Flask, I do use a flask with 42% increased critical strike chance. And that's where, again, I get a good crit buff out. And all my flasks I have, except for my life flask, I have used when charges reach full. So I can just no-brain my way through maps and basically hit like 3 or 4 buttons and not have to piano flask. Dying Sun is needed. The reason why I use Dying Sun is for the extra 2 projectiles and also the AoE, which helps you shotgun with the Volcanic Fissure. And then finally, I run a Bottled Faith because you would be cray if you didn't run Bottled Faith. It just gives you huge amounts of crit. And if I had a better roll on this, I would actually do a lot more crit because this is a pretty low rolled flask as well. But in every possible way, this is a pretty shit version of a Bottled Faith, but it's cheaper, and I'm okay with that because cheap is good. That's what we want. Anyway, that's it for gearing. It's pretty straightforward stuff, so we'll get into the skill gems next. Okay, so skill gems. I'll just talk through from the top here. So on the helm, I have Ancestral War Chief. I have Anomalous Blood and Sand. The reason why I have Anomalous Blood and Sand is because it gives you increased projectile attack damage while in Blood Stance. So that increases your projectile damage while you're in Blood Stance, which is a pretty good buff. I have Enduring Cry, which I have mapped to my move button, so I always pop that as I run around. And I have Anomalous Assassin's Mark. Again, increased damage against enemies that are tagged with Assassin's Mark, so you want the Anomalous version, which is a little more expensive, but you know, it does, yeah, it's Crown of Ice price. It does make the build a hell of a lot more tenable. And I should say, like, when I did the costing at the start of the build, I did include gem costing, because the gem costing is not too bad on this build, but definitely as you get into Awakened gems and stuff like that, it gets more expensive. So on my Brutus, I actually have a custom damage taken set up just on level 11. I have level 15 Molten Shell and level 1 Void Sphere. I just find for mapping Void Sphere is really good because it pulls enemies away from you, and it's just really consistent. Now on my shield, I have an Arrogance set up, so we reserve a bit of health so we can have clarity and precision, and this gives us the ability to almost max out accuracy and our crit, and also lets me sustain my mana pool. And this is the easiest way that I've been able to see that people do this. I could stack up more health and basically have a bigger health pool. I'd have to drop damage, but I find this to be pretty good for mapping, and I think like where it is, I'm going to tank it up more as opposed to add more damage to it, but that's about where my headspace is. In my chest, I've got Anomalous Volcanic Fissure. The reason why you want Anomalous is you get a +1 extra projectile. Standard, you get 4. Anomalous, you get 5. So an extra projectile means 2 extra projectiles, which means nearly 1.5 million DPS or 1.4 million DPS. So, you know, do the math, it's worth it. Focus Ballista. Had a lot of questions about this. The reason why I use it is not because of the Ballista part. The reason why I use it is because supported skills have 68% increased totem placement skill. Just totem, not focus Ballista totems. Totems, just generically. And 35% more attack speed with 9% more damage. This all affects totem attacks, or totem attack totems, I should say. Not specifically Ballista totems, which is why everybody's running this, which is why it's a really good skill gem to use. Earthbreaker, obviously it's a Slam Totem setup, so we need that. Anomalous Inspiration. This allows me to increase my crit again by another 10%, or no, 20%, sorry. So I can fully max out my crit. And then we run Multi-Strike. I don't have an Awakened Multi-Strike. It will go up by like 400,000 DPS with Awakened Multi-Strike, and Divergence like 158,000 or something like that. For now, I just got normal Multi-Strike because it's cheaper and everybody can get that really easily. And a level 5 Awakened Fire Penetration, which also gives me 10% fire exposure on hit. On my gloves, I've got Determination, I've got Anger, I've got Faster Attacks and Leap Slam. And then on my boots, I have Phantasmal Ancestral Protector. The reason why we use a Phantasmal is because it gets 20% increased buff effect. And if you remember what I said in mechanics, that 20% extra buff effect makes your totems do more damage overall because that buff is buffing everything else up. And then beyond that, we've got Culling Strike because, you know, Culling Strike. Multiple totem support and combustion. And again, that does negative 10 fire resistance and 25% chance to ignite. And we already got 25% chance to ignite from the Ascendency. So that just gives you more and more damage. And that's it for the gem setups. It's not too bad, but there is a bit of things that you need to be aware of. Now, there are the builds that use mines to do Wave of Conviction mines, and they used charge mines support in order to beef that up. I don't like doing that because it's more buttons to hit, and to be honest with you, when you're trying to kill a boss and you're fucking around with mines, it makes it a lot harder. I could do way more damage if I did that. That being said, but I'm also lazy and I'm not too worried about farming Ubers. If you want to farm Ubers, you can do that, but just be wary, you're going to be playing piano keys and it's just going to piss you off in boss fights. So, though you might be able to nuke a boss or whatever pretty easily, but there is that. So you can push this build way up. This is my version of playing it, and I prefer to not use mines, but you can if you want. And the reason why mines work, and work even when you have Ancestral Bond selected, is because the way that mines actually work is the skill is being cast by the mine and not by you. So it circumvents Ancestral Bond. So that allows you to generate power and frenzy charges, which you'll do a shitload more damage. So if we had that in the build, for example, if I went and ticked that on, you would do a pretty big chunk more damage and get 100% crit, whatever. I don't think it's worth it, but you know, maybe if you want to take Ubers, you could do it. It's literally just sort of, you know, playing by the skin of your teeth at that point. But anyway, up to you. Anyway, let's get on to the passive tree. Okay, this is the one that we always have contentiousness. No, not really. Okay, so pretty much we come into the starting area up here. We come into the melee starting area. So you want to grab all these nodes up here down to Constitution. Do not grab Iron Will until you actually have your helmet. So you need a Crown of Eyes for Iron Will to do anything. So I wouldn't recommend grabbing it until you got it. And then you'll come across, usually what I do when I first level this character up is I'll come up, I'll then go straight up to Ancestral Bond and then pick up my mace nodes up here. This is going to give me increased crit and damage. And then I'll pick up my life wheel and my sovereignty node and then come back down and then start pushing all the way down to Panopticon, because that's going to give you significantly increased totem damage. And then you can pick up all these Lava Lash, your Dismembering for crit, and everything else on the way down. And that's pretty much, you know, then as you sort of level up, and if anyone's watched my video on how to sort of league start with this, you'll pick up all these other nodes as you move to like level 50 through to level 70. You pick up all these nodes. And then by about level 75, 80, you'll be at a point where you can start kitting out your clusters. And so you would come down and you would grab this cluster first, chuck these nodes in first, get them working, and then move into this cluster as well, because I have double clusters, because I have double weighted advantage and double fuel the fight, which is where a significant amount of my damage comes from. Now, for the jewels that I use in my build, so I'm just using like Crimson jewels, and their stats are crit multi with one-handed weapons, and strength wherever I can find it. And if I have to, I do get a little bit of resistance, which I think I had one down here. There we go. So a little bit of resistance just to scale out, and a little bit of health to try and scale up my defenses. If you're finding you're lacking, you can sort of play with it and compensate the build that way by using jewels. Now, I do have a leadership price here, which has a seed of 13,019. And this is also giving me 20% increased armor. It gives me burning damage, which is useless, but for each one of these nodes, I get +2 strength, and obviously being a strength stacking build, that's pretty significant. +4 on this node. And I also get stun duration, which is useless. But yeah, it gives me some extra stats here. Now, do you need it? Not really. You could chuck something else in here, but entirely up to you what you want to do. Like, pretty much everybody's running it like this, as it is. And for your Watcher's Eye, you want to run one. I run one with crit multi with anger. You can get way better Watcher's Eyes. Mine's not really that good. So if you want to beef the damage up even more, this is one way to do it. Get it with like a fire damage roll or a crit multi with precision, or attack speed roll with precision, and that's going to give you even more damage to play with, which I might even consider as well, to beef the damage up on this more. Outside of that, that's pretty much it for the tree. So just going to the Ascendencies in the center here. So the way that I leveled this up, my first Ascendancy, I got Moon's Presence, because this gave me defense and offense, and it made my my totems immune to fire damage. Gave them more AoE as well. Then I got War's Herald as my second Ascendancy, then Sun's Light as my third, and then finally Death Fury as my fourth. And that's when you get to mapping and you really need that damage buff to drop bosses. This really comes in handy with the extra strength and also the covering of rare enemies or unique enemies with Ash for 10 seconds. That's it for the setup. Oh, I should talk about the clusters. So the large clusters I run two of the same. I basically have Martial Prowess, Fuel the Fight, weighted advantage. And then on my small or my medium clusters here, I have Ancestral Guidance and Ancestral Echo. And I have Ancestral Guidance and Sleepless Sentry, so I can get Onslaught without having to use Flasks or boot enchants or anything like that. So that's it for the tree. It's quite simple. There's not a lot going on. But yeah, if you got any questions, hit me up in the comments below. Alright, so Pantheons I use for this build are Solar Solaris. This is mainly so when I'm versing like bosses, I'm like one-on-one, I'm like, bro, we're going to fight this out. Only one of us is walking out of this room sort of scenario. You can use Solar Lunaris, entirely up to you, depends on where your deficiencies in your build sit. And I use Solar Verslyther, and this is because enemies you've hit recently have 50% reduced life regeneration, which is really good when you're farming Crucibles with Maven, because Maven likes to buff everything with life regeneration. And so by using this, you just basically tell her that, you know, that this is a big fuck you to Maven, and whatever buffs she throws on the bosses that you fight that she's powering up. Also, Life Flask gain 3 charges every 3 seconds if you haven't used a Life Flask recently, which I find to be really, really useful. And because you could die really easily in this build, yeah, 60% increased life recovery from Flask when used on low is actually quite significant. But that's it for Pantheon, really simple stuff. Okay, so for you guys who want to know what you know, I'm using on the build from a you know, MTX perspective. So Stygian Weapon, Sunrise Shield, Forge Guard Body Armor, it just looks really cool. I do have the Soul Harvest Cloak from last league, and also have the Ring of the Victor, again from last league. I have Zealous Pyromaniac Weapon Effect, which I think was a drop on Twitch. And then I've unlocked Victorious Gloves, Helmet, and Boots, which I think look really cool, so I'm running that. And then Iridescent Character Effect from last league. Scavenger Footprints. I've got a Celestial Dying Sun and an Apostate Bottled Faith. Forge Master Portrait Frame, and the Devourer Portal, which was from the last Exile Con, which is my flex of the day, I guess. Because it's really cool and I like it. But that's it for what I've got set up. Oh, and I've also got the Ethereal Fusings effect because I think it's really cool. But yeah, that's it for MTX. Okay, so I hope this guide sort of helps you if you're playing VF Totems. Is this the absolute limit? God, no. You could throw mirrors into this. Like, if you could get Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame and run Aspect of Carnage, your damage is going to go just through the roof. You could potentially get better rings. You could get the Awakened Multi-Strike. It's going to buff it up even more. Aside of that, there's not too much else that you could do. You could get Strength Boots and move away from the Alberons, and then get more modifiers there, potentially. Or a better roll on the implicit roll on the belt. You could get a much better roll on the chest as well because it's not perfectly rolled. It's actually a pretty low roll on strength. It goes up to 120, so one div could really push this up even further. And a better roll on the Bottled Faith and a better roll on the actually this Flask already has a pretty good roll. Yeah, mainly just, you know, minimaxing in that way. That's the format of minimaxing at the end of the day, isn't it? But yeah, that's pretty much it for the build. If you've got any questions, hit me up in the description below. I'll be putting the POB down below as well, so you can sort of have a look and use it as a guide to retweak your build in line with how mine's working. And yeah, so far I think everybody that's reached out to me over the build, and including a few buddies, are having a great time playing this. I found this to be really interesting from a league start perspective, super strong. And it winds up pretty quickly and gets pretty juicy. So at the end of the first week, you know, I've cleared the entire, well, almost the entire Atlas, all the endgame bosses except for Ubers. I didn't show Maven at the start, but I've obviously done Maven. That's how I have the Maven, whatever it is, Voidstone. So yeah, overall, I'm pretty happy with this build. I will be leveling a crazy-ass super tanky Vortex build for Delve next. So stay tuned, and don't forget to like and sub to the channel and to the Twitch. And anyway, until next time, have a good one, and bye.